From musicians to civil rights activists, many of the people in the BLM movement in the United States defending Palestinian rights are drawing parallels between their struggle for racial justice and equality and Palestinian struggle for freedom. Some are also highlighting the similarities between their treatment at the hands of US police and the treatment of Palestinians by the Israeli Defense Forces. Here's how a member of Congress recently put it.
St. Louis and I rise today in solidarity with the Palestinian people and in memory of our brother, Bassem Masri, a Ferguson activist who was with us on the front lines of our uprising for justice following the police murder of Michael Brown Jr. When heavily militarized police forces showed up in Ferguson in 2014, Bassem and so many others of our St. Louis Palestinian community, our Palestinian siblings showed up too. I remember learning that the same equipment that they used to brutalize us is the same equipment that we send to the Israeli military to police and brutalize Palestinians.
Despite the ceasefire between Israel and Hamas, the Israeli military has arrested at least 1,500 Palestinian Israelis who were protesting against Israel's actions in the occupied Sheikh Jarrah neighborhood, Al-Aqsa Mosque, and Gaza. As Israeli forces continued their military raids in cities predominantly inhabited by Palestinian Israelis who make up about 21% of Israel's citizens, more than 500 staffers from the Biden administration and the Democratic Party have called on the US president to, quote, work to end the underlying conditions of occupation, blockade, and settlement expansion that led to this exceptionally destructive period in a 73-year history of dispossession and ethnic cleansing. They also expressed their deep concern that Israel continues to, quote, use US-funded military equipment to kill civilians and violently suppress protesters in Israel, the West Bank, and Jerusalem. For more on the growing solidarity movement in the US with Palestinians, I'm joined by Black Lives Matter activist and co-founder of Black Liberation Collective, Zellie Imani, and Maytha Alhassen, a historian, journalist, and social justice artist. Zellie and Maytha, thank you both so much for being with me. Zellie, let me ask you first. You've been a very strong supporter of the BLM movement, obviously. You've also been a strong, consistent defender of Palestinian rights. Why is this fight so important for you?
Yes. Black Lives Matter as a global movement stands in solidarity with the people of Palestine. Black people throughout the world, we know injustice, we know oppression, we know genocide, we know apartheid, we know the taste of tear gas. And we also know that people who are outside protesting in Palestine are tasting tear gas today in order to taste freedom tomorrow. And these are the same truths that we know. And we know that in order to end oppression here in America, we have to be supporting other liberation struggles elsewhere. And we deeply understand that Black people in America will never be free until the Palestinian people are free as well.
Maytha, two different but two very similar struggles. The issue of injustice being at the core of this, and Zellie just spoke about the taste of tear gas that communities here in the United States, the African American community, has endured, and of course something that Palestinians have lived with as well for a long time. In one of its statements, BLM said the Palestinian fight for justice and equality harkens to our struggle against a repressive state apparatus. Our struggles are connected in many ways, not least because the same Israeli forces forcibly expelling the original inhabitants of Sheikh Jarrah train repressive police forces around the world, including here in the United States. How significant a factor is this for both sides?
The public discourse that really linked the movements that were happening, Black Lives Matter and resistance to settler colonialism in occupied Palestine, became very clear with the Ferguson uprisings in 2014. If you remember, Gaza was being bombarded again just a couple weeks before Michael Brown was murdered and laid in his blood for 4.5 hours. And so when Palestinians tweeted out tips for what to do when you are hit with that taste of tear gas, to use milk instead of water, there was an organic grassroots movement that was building. And people started to realize not only were police forces being trained, US police forces by the IDF in Israel, but there were other connections between Western colonial apparatuses, global apparatuses of of continuing to oppress folks. And something else that came out was the tear gas used in Ferguson on the US-Mexico border, tear gas used against Egyptian protesters, the tear gas used in occupied Palestine was made in the same factory in Pennsylvania. So people were making these connections, but it's also a very historic relationship that has been built over decades.
And so many of the same lethal tactics, aggressive tactics being used by police officers, Zellie. The murder of George Floyd last year, making everyone stop and consider the grave injustices facing the African American community and communities of color here in the United States. Police using their sheer force against unarmed black men, the impunity and lack of accountability. And there have been countless images as well of Palestinian necks being crushed under the knees of Israeli soldiers. I know you have shared a few on your Twitter feed, but where is the outrage? It doesn't seem to exist.
Yeah, I think that for such a long time in America, the discourse and the discussion has been purposely been repressed. For so long, anyone who wanted to speak out against the injustices in occupied Palestine, they were labeled anti-Semitic, or they was gaslighted by being told that the situation was complicated. But it's not complicated, right? The ethnic cleansing is not complicated at all. And that when you're able to explain what's the situation to Palestine, people are understanding injustice because they here experience injustice. And the issue isn't rather that people are trying to, ignore the conversation because it's complicated. People are, purposely being misinformed and purposely being misled. And that doesn't do anything to benefit the people of Palestine. And unfortunately, only benefits Israel and Zionists. And what's happening right now is this creation of this larger space where people are more comfortable to talk about the injustices which is occurring in occupied Palestine, which is a phenomenal thing.
Maytha, there is that almost deliberate, well, quite deliberate campaign to disinform the public. Zellie obviously alluded to it. BLM's statement of solidarity with Palestinians led to this online campaign accusing it of supporting Hamas's militant leaders in Gaza, not the people of Palestine living under brutal military occupation. How do these false accusations, how does this deliberate conflation of anti-Semitism with criticism of the policies of a right-wing Israeli government that continues to perpetuate its occupation affect the resolve of some Americans to stand by Palestinians? Are you seeing more people beginning to see past this attempt to link the two?
I mean, there's an outward slander of people like Bella Hadid and Dua Lipa through New York Times ads that were taken out, and trying to label them terrorist sympathizers for supporting Palestinian human rights. So this one image also harkens back to a long history of trying to stigmatize or take down anybody that's spoken out in support of Palestine. This includes Kwame Ture, who is known as Stokely Carmichael, Ethel Miner, who was somebody who really set the stage for Stokely Carmichael and Kwame Ture's understanding of what's happening. And, there have been multiple responses. One is that sometimes it's a scarecrow tactic and it doesn't hold weight, and other times it becomes devastating. So I'll give you an example. Mark Lamont Hill went on a delegation that I co-organized of Dream Defenders, Black Lives Matter activists, to Palestine in January 2015. And what he saw there was so astounding. He continued to go back and create relationships with Afro-Palestinians, with people who work around ending the carceral state. And when he came back and spoke to the UN on International Solidarity with Palestine Day, the next day CNN fired him. So there are repercussions. And I want to remind folks that when Black people stand up for Palestinians, for Arabs, for Muslims, and of course they can be included in all these categories as well, that we also have to put our lives on the line to stand up for Black lives. And today we are thinking and remembering the murder of George Floyd, as you mentioned, Ghida. We also have to, Palestinians, Arabs in the diaspora in the US, have to remember how we show up in Black communities, including owning grocery stores that call the police on Black people when we know what the end result will be.
And so just how much, Zellie, is there that level of consensus among the African American community to show support for Palestinians? I know your parents were involved in this struggle as well for justice, but even though BLM recently highlighted what they call the deep roots of solidarity between Palestine and US-based liberation movements, traditionally, civil rights organizations were far from unanimous or consistent in their support for Palestinians. What is the situation like today?
The situation right now is very, very hopeful. I go to so many different Palestinian solidarity rallies for the past few weeks, and at these rallies, it's just not chants of free Palestine, but they're also chanting, Black Lives Matter. It's a whole crowd of, Palestinian people, Muslim people, Arab people who are chanting Black Lives Matter. And today at our Black Lives Matter rally, we intend to educate people on the occupation of Palestine and have a whole crowd of majority Black people be chanting Black Lives Matter, Black Lives Matter. Unfortunately, what happened in the 70s and 60s was a suppression and destruction of the US-based liberation movements. So a lot of people lost that history. They lost those connections. But what the Black Lives Matter movement today and what the Liberation for Palestine movement is doing is rebuilding those connections, relearning our history, regaining our memory so that we can move forward. And I'm really excited because both of these movements are merging, and people who didn't necessarily believe in the Black Lives Matter movement earlier are making connections with their own struggles and realizing that these are not just isolated incidences. It's about a state that is repressive, and the state just doesn't exist here in the United States, but it's also existing worldwide.
Maytha, connections and alliances are important, but so is unity. It's an important part of any movement, yet it is something that has traditionally eluded Arabs and Palestinians around the world. Is this moment different? And does unity begin with coalescing around just one theme? There doesn't seem to be a consensus, for example, around one hashtag. It's Free Palestine, it's Safe Sheikh Jarrah, it's Palestinian Lives Matter. How important is it to have one slogan that would be Palestinians alone, that isn't borrowed from any other movement?
Well, I come from a tradition that welcomes productive tensions. So I think that's okay as long as we're looking in the same direction of justice. So we have to look at this history of so many different groups and movements that were in discourse and debate with each other because they were trying to figure out the route to freedom. And as I'm trained around the Black radical tradition, what they say and look at is going to the root. And so that's been part of the work, is trying to understand the root of not just the oppression, but where liberation emerges from that seed. And so what we are looking towards together, hopefully, and what I theorize is through engaged witnessing, is a world where oppressive states do not continue to define the terms of whether we live or die. And so that's what links us. And historically, Zellie mentioned movements in the 60s and the 70s, even going back to the 50s, that saw a world of Afro-Asian solidarity that really popped up because of decolonizing movements in Africa and Asia, and then started to see their power. So today, and for past couple of decades, we've been starting to really see our power in choreography with each other. But we also have to make sure that, like the 60s and 70s and later the 80s, we do not allow the neck of injustice to squeeze and squash us.
The importance of solidarity in the face of injustice. Maytha Alhassen and Zellie Imani, a fascinating discussion. Thank you both so much for being with me.
Thank you.
Thank you.